No, it's okay.
كتب عليكم الصيام كما كتب على الذين من قبلكم لعلكم تتقون أياما معدودات فمن كان منكم مريضا أو على سفر فعدة من أيام أخر وعلى الذين يطيقونه فدية طعام مسكين فمن تطوع خيرا فهو خير له فمن تطوع خيرا فهو خير له وأن تصوموا خير لكم وأن تصوموا خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات على محمد وآل محمد طيب وأنفسكم ونور قلوبكم بذكر الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم رب شهر رمضان الذي أنزلت فيه القرآن وافترضت على عبادك فيه الصيام، صل على محمد وآل محمد وارزقني حج بيتك الحرام في عامي هذا وفي كل عام، واغفر لي تلك الذنوب العظام فإنه لا يغفرها غيرك يا رحمن يا علام. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم إني أفتتح الثناء بحمدك وأنت مسدد للصواب بمنك، وأيقنت أنك أنت أرحم الراحمين في موضع العفو والرحمة، وأشد المعاقبين في موضع النكال والنقمة، وأعظم المتجبرين في موضع الكبرياء والعظمة. اللهم أذنت لي في دعائك ومسألتك، فاسمع يا سميع مدحتي، وأجب يا رحيم دعوتي، وأقل يا غفور عثرتي. فكم يا إلهي من كربة قد فرجتها، وهموم قد كشفتها، وعثرة قد أقلتها، ورحمة قد نشرتها، وحلقة بلاء قد فككتها. الحمد لله الذي لم يتخذ صاحبة ولا ولدا، ولم يكن له شريك في الملك، ولم يكن له ولي من الذل، وكبره تكبيرا. الحمد لله بجميع محامده كلها على جميع نعمه كلها. الحمد لله الذي لا مضاد له في ملكه ولا منازع له في أمره. الحمد لله الذي لا شريك له في خلقه ولا شبيه له في عظمته. الحمد لله الفاشي في الخلق أمره وحمده، الظاهر بالكرم مجده، الباسط بالجود يداه، الذي لا تنقص خزائنه ولا تزيده كثرة العطاء إلا جودا وكرما. إنه هو العزيز الوهاب. اللهم إن من يسألك قليلا من كثير مع حاجة لي إليه عظيما، وغناك عنه قديم، وهو عندي كثير، وهو عليك سهل يسير. اللهم إن عفوك عن ذنبي وتجاوزك عن خطيئتي وصفحك عن ظلمي وسترك على قبيح عملي وحلمك عن كثير جرمي، عندما كان من خطئي وعمدي أطمعني في أن أسألك ما لا أستوجبه منك، الذي رزقتني من رحمتك وأريتني من قدرتك وعرفتني من إجابتك، فصرت أدعوك آمنا وأسألك مستأنسا، لا خائفا ولا وجلا، مدلا عليك فيما قصدت فيه إليك، فإن أبطأ عني عتبت بجهلي عليك، ولعل الذي أبطأ عني هو خير لي لعلمك بعاقبة الأمور. فلم أر مولا كريما أصبر على عبد لئيم منك علي يا رب، إنك تدعوني فأولي عنك وتتحبب إلي فأتبغض إليك وتتودد إلي فلا أقبل منك، كأن اليد تطول عليك فلم يمنعك ذلك من الرحمة لي والإحسان إلي والتفضل علي بجودك وكرمك، فارحم عبدك الجاهل وجد عليه بفضل إحسانك، إنك جواد كريم. الحمد لله مالك الملك مجري الفلك مسخر الرياح فالق الإصباح ديان الدين رب العالمين. الحمد لله على حلمه بعد علمه، والحمد لله على عفوه بعد قدرته، والحمد لله على طول أناته في غضبه، وهو قادر على ما يريد. الحمد لله خالق الخلق باسط الرزق فالق الإصباح ذي الجلال والإكرام والفضل والإنعام، الذي بعد فلا يرى وقرب فشهد النجوى، تبارك وتعالى. الحمد لله الذي ليس له منازع يعادله ولا شبيه يشاكله،
أعظم النعمة علينا فلا أجازي، فكم من موهبة هنيئة قد أعطاني، وعظيمة مخوفة قد كفاني، وبهجة مونقة قد أراني، فأثني عليه حامدا وأذكره مسبحا. الحمد لله الذي لا يهتك حجابه ولا يغلق بابه ولا يرد السائل ولا يخيب آمل. الحمد لله الذي يؤمن الخائفين وينجي الصالحين ويرفع المستضعفين ويضع المستكبرين ويهلك ملوكا ويستخلف آخرين. والحمد لله قاصم الجبارين مبير الظالمين مدرك الهارمين نكال الظالمين صريخ المستصرخين موضع حاجات الطالبين معتمد المؤمنين. الحمد لله الذي من خشيته ترعد السماء وسكانها وترجف الأرض وعمارها وتموج البحار ومن يسبح في غمراتها. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. الحمد لله الذي يخلق ولم يخلق ويرزق ولا يرزق ويطعم ولا يطعم ويميت الأحياء ويحيي الموتى وهو حي لا يموت بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير. اللهم صل على محمد عبدك ورسولك وأمينك وصفيك وحبيبك وخيرتك من خلقك وحافظ سرك ومبلغ رسالاتك أفضل وأحسن وأجمل وأكمل وأزكى وأنمى وأطيب وأطهر وأسنى وأكثر ما صليت وباركت وترحمت وتحننت وسلمت على أحد من عبادك وأنبيائك ورسلك وصفوتك وأهل الكرامة عليك من خلقك. اللهم وصل على علي أمير المؤمنين ووصي رسوله رب العالمين عبدك ووليك العظيم. وصل على الصديقة الطاهرة فاطمة سيدة نساء العالمين. وصل على صبي الرحمة وإمامي الهدى الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة. وصل على أئمة المسلمين علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والخلف الهادي المهدي. حججك على عبادك وأمنائك في بلادك صلاة كثيرة دائمة. اللهم وصل على ولي أمرك القائم المؤمن والعدل المنتظر وحفه بملائكتك المقربين وأيده بروح القدس يا رب العالمين. اللهم اجعله الداعية إلى كتابك والقائم بدينك. استخلفه في الأرض كما استخلفت الذين من قبله. مكن له دينه الذي ارتضيته له. أبدله من بعد خوفه أمنا يعبدك لا يشرك بك شيئا. اللهم أعزه وأعزز به وانصره وانتصر به وانصره نصرا عزيزا وافتح له فتحا يسيرا واجعل له من لدنك سلطانا نصيرا. اللهم أظهر به دينك وسنة نبيك حتى لا يستخفي بشيء من الحق مخافة أحد من الخلق. اللهم إنا نرغب إليك في دولة كريمة تعز بها الإسلام وأهله وتذل بها النفاق وأهله وتجعلنا فيها من الدعاة إلى طاعتك والقادة إلى سبيلك وترزقنا بها كرامة الدنيا والآخرة. اللهم ما عرفتنا من الحق فحملنا وما قصرنا عنه فبلغنا. اللهم المؤمن به شعبنا واشعب به صدعنا وارتق به فتقنا وكثر به قلتنا وأعزز به ذلتنا وأغن به عائلنا واقض به عن مغرمنا واجبر به فقرنا وسد به خلتنا ويسر به عسرنا وضيق به وجوهنا به أسرنا وأنجح به طلبتنا وأنجز به مواعيدنا واستجب به دعوتنا وأعطنا به سؤلنا وبلغنا به من الدنيا والآخرة آمالنا وأعطنا به فوق رغبتنا يا خير المسؤولين وأوسع المعطين اشف به صدورنا وأذب به غيظ قلوبنا واهدنا به لما اختلف فيه من الحق بإذنك إنك تهدي من تشاء إلى صراط مستقيم وانصرنا به على عدوك وعدونا إله الحق آمين. اللهم إنا نشكو إليك فقد نبينا صلواتك عليه وآله وغيبة ولينا وكثرة عدونا وقلة عددنا وشدة الفتن بنا وتظاهر الزمان علينا فصل على محمد وآله وأعنا على ذلك بفتح منك تعجل وبضر تكشف ونصر تعز وسلطان حق تظهر ورحمة منك تجللنا وعافية منك تلبسنا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم برحمتك في الصالحين فأدخلنا وفي علين فارفعنا وبكأس من معين من عين سلسبيل فاسقنا ومن الحور العين برحمتك فزوجنا ومن الولدان المخلدين كأنهم لؤلؤ مكنون فأخبرنا ومن ثمار الجنة ولحوم الطير فأطعمنا ومن ثياب السندس والحرير والاستبرق فألبسنا وليلة القدر وحج بيتك الحرام وقتلا في سبيلك فوفق لنا وصالح الدعاء والمسألة فاستجب لنا وإذا جمعت الأولين والآخرين يوم القيامة فارحمنا وبراءة من النار فاكتب لنا وفي جهنم فلا تخلنا وفي عذابك وهوانك فلا تبتلنا ومن الزقوم والضريع فلا تطعمنا ومع الشياطين فلا تجعلنا وفي النار على وجوهنا فلا تكببنا ومن ثياب النار وسرابيل القطران فلا تلبسنا ومن كل سوء يا لا إله إلا أنت بحق لا إله إلا أنت فنجنا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.
وعجل الظهور ومد الحضور شفاء المرضى والمسلمين المنظورين ونوصلنا بالدعاء الخاصة لأرواح العلماء والشهداء وجميع المؤمنين والمؤمنات ومن مات على الإيمان لجميع من تواب الفاتحة مشروعة بذكر الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد ثلاثا بأعلى الأصوات. اللهم صل على
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Can we have another loud salawat for Hajj Ahmed Hamdan? صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ramadan Kareem. Inshallah, we will be having our annual Shahr Ramadan program, English and Arabic. First weekend, we will be having Dr. Sadiq Qasim with us. We're very honored to have him. Inshallah, the second weekend, we'll be having Sayyid Haidar Bahr al-Ulum. And then the second 2 weeks, we'll be having Sheikh Hussam al-Attar. Now, Dr. Sadiq Qasim is a dear brother of ours. He's a scholar, and he needs no introduction. Everyone, please help me welcome Dr. Sadiq to the stage. بعد الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. لقد جاءت رسل ربنا بالحق ونودوا أن تلكم الجنة ورثتموها بما كنتم تعملون. والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا وحبيب قلوبنا السراج المنير المصطفى الأمجد أبا القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المظلومين وعلى أصحابه الغر الميامين. أما بعد، يقول الله في المحكم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ولله المشرق والمغرب فأينما تولوا فثم وجه الله إن الله واسع عليم. صدق الله العلي العظيم. My dear respected scholars, my dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First, I'd like to thank you, and I'm very honored for the invitation to speak here for the next few nights. This ayah that I recited occurs in Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter number 2 of the Quran. And it's an interesting ayah because twice in Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala confronts the perception among both Muslims and non-Muslims about the geographic limitation of Islam. Meaning what? Meaning during the time of the early Muslims, there were several incidents, there were several situations where people essentially brought up the question about the geographic limitation of Islam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in each instance responds by declaring the universality of the religion of Islam. So this ayah that I recited, which is verse number 115, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَشْرِقُ وَالْمَغْرِبِ, and to Allah belongs the east and the west. فَأَيْنَمَا تَوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wherever you, in whichever direction you lean, the face or the presence of Allah is present. إِنَّ اللَّهَ وَاسِعٌ عَلِيمٌ. Most surely Allah is most expansive, all knowledgeable. This ayah was revealed in the early history of Islam upon the death of the Christian king of Abyssinia, al-Najashi. Remember, eventually he converted to Islam. Well, when the Christian king who converted to Islam passed away, the Prophet ﷺ performed Salat al-Janazah for him, according to some reports. And so the early Muslims said, Ya Rasulullah, how could you perform this death prayer? How could you perform the Salat for this Christian? Yeah, obviously he wasn't a believer in Islam. He prayed in a different direction. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds to these early Muslims by saying, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَشْرِقُ وَالْمَغْرِبِ, meaning to Allah belongs the east and the west. فَأَيْنَمَا تَوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wherever you, in whichever direction you look at, is the face of Allah, or is the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second ayah, which also occurs in Surah Al-Baqarah, is verse number 142. And this ayah, I think, is more relevant to tonight's discussion. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, سَيَقُولُ السُّفَهَاءُ مِنَ النَّاسِ مَا وَلَّهُمْ عَنْ قِبْلَتِهِمْ الَّتِي كَانُوا عَلَيْهَا قُلْ لِلَّهِ الْمَشْرِقُ وَالْمَغْرِبِ يَهْدِي مَنْ يَشَاءُ إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. This ayah was revealed upon the occasion of the changing of the prayer direction. Because remember, in the early days, the Muslims were praying towards the city of Jerusalem, Al-Quds, which was the first qibla for the Muslims. During one of the afternoon prayers, probably Salat al-Dhuhr or al-Asr, the Prophet receives a revelation from the angel Jibra'il to change the prayer direction from Jerusalem to Mecca. And this happened mid-prayer. So the Prophet, in the middle of the Salat, changes the direction from Quds to Mecca. And that's why if you go to Medina today, there's a masjid called Masjid al-Qiblatain, or the Masjid of the two Qiblas. This is the only masjid that exists in the world that has two prayer directions, or two mihrabs. Anyway, after the Muslims changed their prayer direction towards Mecca, the silly people, سَيَقُولُ السُّفَهَاء, the silly people, said, مَا وَلَّهُمْ عَنْ قِبْلَتِهِمْ الَّتِي كَانُوا عَلَيْهَا. What has caused them to change their prayer direction? قُلْ لِلَّهِ الْمَشْرِقُ وَالْمَغْرِبِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet and the Muslims to say, to Allah belongs the east and the west. يَهْدِي مَنْ يَشَاءُ إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. I love this ayah for two reasons. The first reason that I love this ayah is because here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the universality of the submission towards the Almighty, Islam. Meaning Allah doesn't limit Islam to the east, He doesn't limit Islam to the west, but rather Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is declaring the universality of the concept of the submission towards the Almighty Creator. لِلَّهِ الْمَشْرِقُ وَالْمَغْرِبِ يَهْدِي مَنْ يَشَاءُ إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. The second reason that I love this ayah is because it gives the Muslim a method for responding to people who attack the religion. See, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here, سَيَقُولُ السُّفَهَاء, the silly people will say, what has caused them to change their direction? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala challenges the Muslims. Don't just run away from the silly people. Don't just, hide and essentially isolate yourself in fear. But قُلْ لِلَّهِ الْمَشْرِقُ وَالْمَغْرِبِ. Respond to them in a firm and educated manner. Now this ayah is really relevant to modern times today. Because in America today, and I don't need to discuss this too much, in America today, we have a very similar situation where many people believe that Islam is the religion of the East. It's not a religion of the country. So oftentimes you'll hear of these situations where you have the Muslim ban, or people saying, go back home. But the reality is, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, لِلَّهِ الْمَشْرِقُ وَالْمَغْرِبِ. To Allah belongs the east and the west. And what I hope to do here tonight is essentially, discuss the history of Islam in America. Because oftentimes, in the modern situation, I feel that we as Muslims are oftentimes on the defensive. We're always reacting to the narrative that's being placed out there. And we have nothing positive to replace that narrative with. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here is saying, when the silly people say, Allah is challenging the Muslims. Come up with your own narrative, a positive narrative, an intellectual narrative that can counteract the negative propaganda. And within this context, I feel oftentimes that as Muslims in America, we don't know our own story in this country, and as such, we're unable to really present a positive counter-image. Oftentimes, the images that we present are defensive. They're press releases where we say, well, the Muslims stand against terrorism. But what positive do we have to counteract that? So what I hope to do here tonight is, for the next 30 to 40 minutes, present a talk that I've given at various universities around the country, where talking about the history of Islam in America. And inshallah, this will provide some fruit or some seeds to essentially enable us to understand better our position in this country, especially with relation to this ayah, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَشْرِقُ وَالْمَغْرِبِ. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that the religion of Islam is universal, can we in fact demonstrate that? Meaning, can we show that in the history of Islam in America? So the title of tonight's talk is Muslims in America, a brief history from Columbus to Trump. Next slide, please. This slide here essentially demonstrates some of the recent statistics. This was a report that was presented by the Council on American Islamic Relations. It's talking about the situation of Muslims in America. This report was just released 2 weeks ago. And the main message here, you don't need to focus on the numbers, but I think many of you can appreciate the main takeaway of this slide, that over the past 3 years, both hate crimes and acts of discrimination against Muslims have increased, exponentially, I would say. And the next slide will the reason for this increase in acts of discrimination and hate crimes really is because of this type of narrative that's out there in the mainstream media and the types of books that are published. So these are some of the recent New York Times bestsellers written by individuals like Ayan Hirsi Ali, Bridget Gabriel, Wafa Sultan, and of course, some of the recent ideas that were perpetuated during the recent election cycle. Now, the problem with this type of narrative, obviously, with these types of books that are titled like They Must Be Stopped and Infidel and The Trouble with Islam Today, is they present Islam as a foreign entity within the American landscape and within the American soil. Next slide, please. And this is another picture. This is an incident that recently took place in New York. And I think oftentimes they say a picture is 1,000 words. I think this holds true for this picture as well. New York, a very liberal state, specifically New York City. Here we had the Muslim community over there, presenting a request to build a masjid in Long Island. And you can see the Muslim individual there, the sister, presenting her case. And then you can see the reaction of the local Long Island non-Muslim community. So if a picture is 1,000 words, I think this picture really conveys the essence of the situation that oftentimes Muslims feel that we're confronted with today. And it's unfortunate because, next slide please, as a beautiful book by a rabbi over at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles. He's written a beautiful book on the concept of jihad in Islam. And it's really interesting to see the Jewish or rabbinical perspective on this Islamic concept. I think he does tremendous justice to the concept. Anyway, in his book on the concept of jihad, the Rabbi Reuven Firestone goes on to say that Islam is perhaps the most misunderstood religion to the West, and many stereotypes still hinder clarity about its tenets and practices. Western prejudice toward Islam is as old as Islam itself. Now think about that. So as long as Islam has been in existence, according to the historical record, there's always been this intrinsic bias against the religion of Islam. And this is something that gets inherited generation after generation. It's become essentially distilled and concentrated towards what we have today. And it's unfortunate because, as the next slide I think makes the point, this is a professor, Gustav Niebuhr, over at Princeton University, has a beautiful point where he says, many Americans don't seem to recognize that our country, in its individuals, if not institutions, has always been more religiously diverse than it appeared, a trend that certainly continues today. All this gets obscured when people speak wistfully of the United States as a Christian nation. And I think, I would add to Professor Niebuhr's quote here, it's not just many Americans, but I would say also many people who've come here from outside of America. I would say, many Muslims who've emigrated here will intrinsically believe that this is a Christian country in its essence. But what I hope to demonstrate here tonight is that Islam and the presence of Islam has made tremendous contributions from even the time before Columbus. Which brings me up to the first point. So how many of you have heard of Christopher Columbus? Yeah, everyone in here has heard of Christopher Columbus. Now, how many of you have heard of a man named Mahi or Cheng Ho? Okay, we have two, mashallah, very good. Well, next slide. This is Cheng Ho. He was a Muslim Chinese sailor. His Islamic name was Mahi. Ma is the Chinese form of Muhammad. So Mahi has a very interesting story. He was a young Muslim eunuch who was adopted by the Chinese emperor of the time during the Ming Dynasty. And the Chinese emperor, developed a really strong relationship with Cheng Ho, and he ended up relying on him. So the Chinese emperor built this tremendous navy. The Chinese Navy is probably one of the greatest navies in the history of the world. And he appointed Cheng Ho to become the commander of the Navy. Now, why is this relevant? Well, there's really very compelling evidence that Cheng Ho, at least 71 years before the arrival of Columbus in the New World, in the quote New World, obviously it was occupied by other people before Columbus was here, so it wasn't new to them. But anyway, to the Western Europeans, it was the New World. At least 71 years before the arrival of Columbus, there's compelling evidence that Cheng Ho and his navy actually ended up landing on the west coast of the United States, somewhere in California. This was all written in a book, which I've cited in the bottom here, 1421, the year that China discovered the world, by a British historian named Gavin Menzies. This is a tremendous book, a New York Times bestseller list. And just to give you the appreciation of the Chinese Navy that was led by this Muslim sailor, Cheng Ho. Next slide, please. I don't know how clear this picture is, but what I want to show you here is a picture of one of Cheng Ho's ships, which is depicted in white, contrasted with one of Columbus's ships, the Santa Maria. So you can notice that Cheng Ho's fleet of ships, the typical ship was at least 3 to 4 times larger than Christopher Columbus's ships. Now, Gavin Menzies goes on to say about some of the technological innovations that the Chinese sailors came up with that were really far advanced of the Western European sailors. So, for example, during Columbus's time, many of the people who sailed with Columbus would suffer from something called scurvy. Scurvy is a disease where you don't have enough fresh fruit, you don't have enough vitamin C. And the reason for that is because they wouldn't pack fresh fruit on the ships. Now, interestingly, the Chinese ships of Cheng Ho had a mechanism for desalinating or removing salt from the ocean water. So on their ships, they were able to grow fresh fruits and vegetables, which enabled them to go long distances, much longer distances than the average, Western European ship. Another interesting point that Gavin Menzies mentions is actually in the next slide here. The Chinese ships of Cheng Ho, the Muslim Cheng Ho, actually went all over the east. They went to India, they went to the Arabian Peninsula, they went to Africa, and then from the other end they went to most likely the western coast of the United States in California. So they went all over. But Gavin Menzies makes a really interesting point. He says, unlike the Western European ships where the explorers, whatever country they would go to, they would kill the native population, the Chinese ships would actually be very respectful of the local indigenous religions. So Cheng Ho, for example, although he was a practicing Muslim, he was very respectful of the native religions of the different countries. The point being that it was a very different dynamic compared to the traditional Western European ships. Salawat. And one final thing that I wanted to show here from Cheng Ho's ships, one of the outputs of the shipping of Cheng Ho, next slide please, is arguably the first world map known in existence, which was drawn by a Turkish geographer or cartographer named Piri Reis. So this Piri Reis world map was really the outcome of the expeditions of Cheng Ho. At least in 1513, this is the first time that we know of that the world map depicting all of the continents came to existence. And this was really mechanism, an output or an outcome of Cheng Ho's expeditions, where a lot of this information would filter back to different parts of the Chinese and the Asian continent, and it would eventually make its way into Turkey. So the point being here that the common narrative that the Western European explorers like Columbus and Magellan and others came to the West is actually problematic, because we know in addition to Cheng Ho, there were many other individuals that came here at least tens if not hundreds of years before Columbus. Now, interestingly, it wasn't just the early expeditions, but many of the early people who came to the American continent were forcibly taken out of their native homes and were Muslim by origin. Many of them came from a part of Western Africa that was ruled by a Muslim emperor at the time named Mensa Musa. Next slide, please. And it was a area of Africa called the Mali Empire. This was an important part of the Muslim world at the time. A lot of tremendous scholarship and schools and Qur'ans and scholars were studying here in this part of the world. It was ruled by a man named Mensa Musa. Now, the interesting thing here is that many of the slaves that came over to America, many of the Africans that came over to America, were actually from this part of the area of Africa. So if you go to the next slide here, it's estimated that 10 to 30% of Africans brought to the Americas were from the sub-Saharan region of the Mali Empire, meaning they were Muslim in origin. And, these Muslims, over time, they participated in many of the seminal events of America's founding. So there's a scholar at the University of Florida who's doing an entire PhD dissertation on the contribution of the early African Muslims to America's history. And what she's concluded is that African Muslims fought in the War of 1812, the Civil War, the American Revolution. They've been here and present since the country was, since even before the country was a country. And this is an important point that oftentimes gets overlooked. that many of the early settlers in America were forcibly migrated here, but they came from a predominantly Muslim area. And in fact, when they came here, many of them still retained the practice of their religion. So I'm going to give you in the next few slides some of the stories of these African Muslims who were forcibly taken out of their Muslim lands and brought here to America. But despite that, they were still able to practice their religion and essentially leave behind some of the important historical milestones with regard to the history of Islam in America. One of these first individuals is a man, next slide please, a man named Estevanico of Azamor. Estevanico was a Muslim from the Spanish region of Cordoba and Granada. Estevanico translates into Little Stephen. He was a Muslim of African origin, what we call a Moor, the Moors. So Estevanico was captured and sold into slavery, and along with his Spanish European master, they sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, and they came, and their ship essentially encountered a hurricane, and it ended up being capsizing in the island of Haiti, modern-day Haiti. So Estevanico left his slave master and went on a journey of his own. This is an important journey because what Estevanico ended up doing is he ended up crossing the continental U.S. So he's the first non-Native American to cross the Mississippi River. Oftentimes in American history, they tell you that Lewis and Clark are the first non-Native Americans to cross the Mississippi River. The reality is that it was a Muslim named Estevanico of Azamor, and this is all documented in a beautiful book called Estevanico, Black Explorer in Spanish Texas. This Muslim individual named Estevanico, who essentially, according to this book, maintained the practice of his religion. So he would pray, along the journey. He would encounter the Native Americans, and he would try to engage them in diplomacy. In fact, if you go to Texas, there's this entire museum dedicated to the life of Estevanico as being the first non-Native American to cross the Mississippi River, at least 200-300 years before Lewis and Clark. Next slide, please. Now, of course, not many of the stories were that positive. There were many, heartbreaking stories of the early Muslims. One of the early Muslims was this man named Abdul Rahman ibn Suri. Abdul Rahman was a well-known prince in Western Africa. But somehow, accidentally, he got captured and sold into slavery, and he was brought over into America. Now, when he was brought over into America, Abdul Rahman would repeatedly tell his slave masters, listen, I shouldn't be here. I'm a prince. My father's the king. And the slave masters obviously wouldn't believe him because they probably, heard this story regularly, right? Like everyone's claiming to be a prince. So anyway, Abdul Rahman ibn Suri was held in captivity for a period of 30 years. But after 30 years, eventually word got to the State Department in the United States at the time, oh, by the way, we've accidentally captured this African prince. Maybe we should free him. So the president at the time, a man named John Quincy Adams, finds out about Abdul Rahman ibn Suri and grants him his freedom. And he apologizes profusely to Abdul Rahman ibn Suri, and he gives him parades in different cities in America. So in Philadelphia, in Boston, in Washington, D.C., as a tour of apology from the United States, they apologize to Abdul Rahman ibn Suri for capturing him and enslaving him for 30 years, and they give him tours of victory. So this is all captured in a beautiful book named Prince Among Slaves by a man named Terry Alford, and I've put this citation here in case you want to follow up on this. Now, unfortunately, not everyone's story ends on a happy ending like Abdul Rahman ibn Suri. Next slide, please. Yes. So this man, Umar ibn Sa'id, was a hafiz of the Quran. So he had memorized the entire Quran. He was living in Western Africa at the time. But he was captured into slavery and sold and brought over into America. Unfortunately, his slave master was a very vicious and hard-hearted man. he forcibly made Umar ibn Sa'id convert into Christianity. So he would serve Umar ibn Sa'id pork, he would make him attend the Christian services. But Umar ibn Sa'id was a learned man who had memorized the Quran. And as a way to review the Quran with himself, he would always, whenever he had some money, he would buy a pencil and some paper from back then. Remember, pen and paper was very expensive. And he would try to write down whatever Quranic verses he could memorize, whatever he had memorized, just to keep his memory awake. So the point being here, that Umar ibn Sa'id, despite the tremendous pressure that he faced from his slave master, still found a way to retain his Islamic practice and his Islamic knowledge. And he's an important figure in the history of Islam in America, because he's the first individual that we know of who put down the Quran in writing in the United States. So if you go to the University of North Carolina, you'll see that they've preserved the manuscripts of Umar ibn Sa'id from the time that he was here back in the 1700s, during the time of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And they've preserved the first handwritten Quran in the United States. Well, as much of the Quran as he could write. So here you could see, this is Surah An-Nasr. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Idha ja'a Nasrullahi wal-Fath. And you can see that there's certain, mistakes in his transcription of the surah, because obviously over time, he essentially starts misplacing different ayahs. But the point here, I think, with Umar ibn Sa'id is, despite, we talk about Islamophobia today, but imagine, this is true Islamophobia. When the man was prevented from practicing his religion, but despite these hardships, he was still able to retain the practice and essentially contribute something positive to the American experience. Salawat. Next slide, please. We can skip this slide. Yes. So, here we're in the month of Ramadan, and obviously I wanted to tell you about the first iftar that actually ever took place in the White House. Every year it's an annual tradition that the president invites Muslims to come and break iftar, have iftar with him. The question becomes, when did this practice originate? The historical record tells us that it originated during the time of Thomas Jefferson. So during Thomas Jefferson's time, there were some difficulties between the United States and the country of Tunisia, modern-day Tunisia. They had some, issues with regard to the Tunisian ships would capture the American ships, and the American ships would capture the Tunisian ships. So there were some, national security issues between Tunisia and the United States. So the emperor of Tunisia at the time sent over a Tunisian delegation of Muslims, led by this man named Sidi Suleiman Meli Meli, who came here in 1805 to essentially undergo diplomacy with the United States, to try to figure out a resolution to these difficulties between Tunisia and between the United States. And as part of goodwill, Thomas Jefferson, Sayyid Suleiman Meli Meli came here during the month of Ramadan. He stayed here for an entire month. As one of the evenings of Ramadan, as an act of goodwill, as an act of good faith, Thomas Jefferson invited Sidi Suleiman Meli Meli and his crew to come to the White House and have iftar, essentially at the time of sunset. And this is, according to the historical record, the first incident where the American president invites the Muslim delegation to have iftar. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of formal trade relations with a Muslim country, Oman, holds that record. So Oman has had relations with the United States, commercial relations, since the time of at least George Washington. So since the 1790s, the Sultan of Oman had always been an individual who wanted to engage in good faith with the United States in terms of trading relationships. And this came to a head formally in 1805, when they actually formalized the relationships between Oman and between the United States. It was this Omani ship called the Sultana that came here, arrived in Washington, D.C., and it entered into a formal trade agreement with the president at the time, Martin Van Buren. And what you're seeing here is a postage stamp from the country of Oman on the 200th anniversary of this trading partnership between Oman and between the United States. So in terms of the first Muslim majority government that had a relationship with the United States, that title belongs to Oman. But beyond commercial and beyond diplomatic relationships, Islam has had a more subtle impact on American society. And this is really most obviously seen in the literature and in the writings of many of the prominent Americans in America. And that's what the next section will be talking about. Next slide, please. So Benjamin Franklin, as all of you know, the man on the $100 bill, was arguably one of the most intellectual and the most well-read of the founding fathers of America. He was a particular fan of Persian poetry, specifically of a man named Sa'di. Sa'di is a well-known Persian poet. So one day, he fell in love with one of Sa'di's poems so much that he decided to take one of Sa'di's poems and go to different people within his circle and tell them that he's discovered a new verse of the Bible. Essentially, Franklin had done some excavation, and he found a verse of the Bible that had completely been overlooked during the compilation of the Bible. So Franklin was somewhat of a hero to the intellectual circles at the time. They said, wow, Franklin, you've invented electricity, you've helped to put together this American government, and you've also found a previously unknown passage of the Bible. Well, what ended up happening is people eventually found out that Franklin had actually plagiarized the poems from Sa'di. So what he said was a biblical verse was actually a poem from Sa'di. And eventually this was a big scandal during the 1700s. How can this, non-Muslim take the poems of a Muslim man and essentially pass them off as part of the Bible? So the question becomes, what was the poem that so enthralled Franklin that he thought it should be part of the Bible? Well, the poem is actually in the next slide. And this poem, by the way, is hanging at the front entryway of the United Nations. Here in this poem by al-Sa'di, Sa'di goes on to say, and I see Haidar al-Sa'di smiling, so I don't know if he's related to you, but So here Sa'di, the poet says, human beings are members of a whole in creation of one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted with pain, other members uneasy will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. This is the poem of Sa'di that Franklin thought should be part of the Bible, because the message that it's conveying is a message of universality and the universal human commonality and the link in terms of of humanity. And it goes beyond that. Many of the early American philosophers and American thinkers were tremendously influenced by both Imam Ali and by Muslim Sufism. And I'll show you what I mean here in the next slide. So this is Rumi. He's one of the famous Muslim scholars. You can see the influence of Rumi on these two important American philosophers, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the individual on the top, and then Henry David Thoreau. They're arguably considered the most important philosophers in America. They came up with this movement called the Transcendentalist movement, which is a very important native-born movement that started in Massachusetts and became the most important American philosophy to come out of the United States. Well, anyway, the next slide here gets to my point. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his personal works, so this is taken from the complete works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Lectures and Biographical Sketches, Volume 10. And Ralph Waldo Emerson's library is located in Boston, so this is where I went out there and I actually was able to identify this among his writings. Ralph Waldo Emerson has several portions of his journal where he talks about Imam Ali. He says the Khalif Ali is a fine example of character, according to Ralph Waldo Emerson. So Ali ibn Abi Talib called for his courage the lion of God. Muhammad said of him, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, I am the city of knowledge, but Ali is the gate. Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, various are the virtues, O Ali, by which men are brought near to their Creator, but thou by thy intellect art created near, and standest before them by many degrees of approach. So here, Ralph Waldo Emerson is talking about the high intellect of Imam Ali alayhi salam, and essentially, holding him up as a fine example of character and as a fine example of how an individual should behave with regard to their character and their relations with other people and with regard to their relations to God. Ralph Waldo Emerson, like I said, is an important figure in American philosophy because he influenced many of the subsequent romantic writers during the time, many of the romantic poets in America. And arguably one of the most important romantic poets in America, a man named the most important poet in the history of America, is this man, Walt Whitman. Next slide, please. Walt Whitman, it's really interesting. There's this entire group in academia that is studying whether Walt Whitman was actually a Sufi Muslim or not. Because many of Walt Whitman's writings allude to the fact that Walt Whitman had a profound understanding of Islam as conveyed by the Sufis. So one of the poems that really strikes the interest of many of the American academic scholars and Western scholars is this poem that was written by Walt Whitman in 1891 called A Persian Lesson. And this is a beautiful poem, and I'll just read part of it for you. The background to this poem is Walt Whitman is talking about this scholar, a Muslim scholar, who's giving a class to his student. And so this is what the poem is communicating, what the teacher is saying to his students. So the poem goes as follows. Finally, my children, to envelop each word, each part of the rest, Allah is all, is eminent in every life and object. Maybe at many and many a more removes, yet Allah is here. So when the Western academics look at this, they say this man, Walt Whitman, if you look at his personal journals, he talks very intimately about his knowledge of this transcendent creator, an all-encompassing creator that transcends everything. And this is really something that's heavily influenced by various Muslim philosophies. So that's just a small, I would say, section of the influence of Islam on various American writers and poets. We can spend all night here. As I mentioned, there are entire scholars who've dedicated their life to looking at the influence of Islamic philosophy on American literature and American arts. But we won't spend the rest of the night here because I wanted to tell you about some interesting characters and stories of Islam in America. And we'll close up with this final section, and then we can open it up for questions or comments. So here, this is an interesting story. This story occurs during the Civil War. Remember, the Civil War in America was a fight between who? Who can tell me who the Civil War was between? Yes, you in the back. What's that? Yes, Robert E. Lee, representing who? The South, and I guess the other side was who? Abe Lincoln and the North, right? So as part of the Northern armies, the Union armies, had this thing called the scorched earth policy. So any library and any institution of higher learning in the South, they would burn to the ground. And what you see here in the upper left corner is a Union general, a man named General Croxton. General Croxton arrives in Alabama. Next slide, please. And in Alabama, he sees the beautiful University of Alabama library. He's commanded to burn it down to the ground. So the University of Alabama had one of the most expansive libraries in America. And the gentleman on the bottom right is a man named Andre Delofre. He was the librarian of the University of Alabama. So the librarian goes to General Croxton and he begs him, he pleads with him, please don't burn down this library. This is the most impressive collection of books in the South and in America. So General Croxton says, okay, you seem like a good man. I still need to burn down the library, but as an act of good faith, I'll let you select one book from your library to preserve. And does anyone want to guess what book he saves? The Quran, exactly. So if you go to the next slide here, this is the Quran that he preserves, the Quran Andre Delofre, and this Quran is still held by the newly rebuilt library at the University of Alabama. And then General Croxton afterwards asks Andre Delofre, you had thousands of books here. Why out of all of these books did you choose this English translation of the Quran? He said, all of the other books were replaceable. This is the only book that was irreplaceable. Now, I don't know if he meant it in terms of content or if he meant it in terms of, back then they didn't have Amazon, so you can't just order books. So maybe it was a difficult book to, order. But the point being that, this Andre Delofre had a wide selection of books that he could have chosen from, but he ended up choosing the Quran. Next story. Next slide, please. So this is an interesting story, and this occurs at the beginning of World War I. At the beginning of World War I, the United States knew that it was going to engage in battle in places in northern Africa, so places with lots of desert. And they thought that the best vehicle for engaging in warfare in northern Africa were camels. But they had no one in America that could raise camels and could train camels. So what they ended up doing is they went to Lebanon and they found a man named Hajj Ali who said, yes, I can raise camels for you, So they brought Hajj Ali over to the United States along with something like 100 camels. Now, as any of you know, Lebanon doesn't have many deserts. It doesn't have many camels. So Hajj Ali didn't really know anything about camels. So what ended up happening is after a few months, many of Hajj Ali's camels ended up dying, and Hajj Ali left the work of raising camels and he opened up a diner. But there's a monument in Arizona to Hajj Ali, which is shaped as a pyramid. Now this is interesting because, as many of you know, there are no pyramids in Lebanon, right? So even in the gravestone that they've built for Hajj Ali, there's this tremendous misunderstanding of Muslims and the geography. But it's an interesting story because at the time they couldn't pronounce Hajj Ali's name, so they would call him Hajj Ali. That was his official name on the record books. So if you look up the camels of Hajj Ali in Arizona, this is the man that you'll see, Hajj Ali. Next slide, please. In terms of the first masjid in America, there's a lot of discussion about where the first masjid was built, and there's really no good answer that I've come across. But one potential answer is the masjid that was built by this man, Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb. Alexander Russell Webb was a journalist. He was working in New York at the time. He was good friends with Mark Twain, and eventually he converted to Islam. And when he converted to Islam, he decided to build a masjid in downtown New York, somewhere around the year 1891. So Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb, he raises some money. He's able to build the masjid in downtown New York in 1891. But the problem with that masjid is it was a beautiful building, but no one would attend the masjid. So after a few years, the masjid went out of business. And that's why it's no longer standing there. Now, the interesting story here is when the masjid went out of business, the New York Times, the following day, came up with the following headline. Next slide, please. It said, Fall of Islam in America. Story of a Muslim propaganda that came to grief. Muslims failed to agree. So the New York Times back in 1891 talks about this, new institution, but it falls apart because the Muslims don't agree. And the New York Times goes on to say that this is probably the end of Islam in America. Because if they couldn't, build this masjid here in New York, then, what hope is there? Well, alhamdulillah, like many incidents, the New York Times was incorrect. So, but there were other masajid that were built in New York. Next slide, please. Next. Remember the controversy a few years ago when they wanted to build a masjid near Ground Zero? This story came out during that time. When the historians went back and looked at the history of the area near Ground Zero, they found that actually back in the late 1800s, the entire area was filled with Syrian and Lebanese Muslims. So there were masajid near the Ground Zero back all the way, during that time. And in fact, they called that area Little Syria. And this is a picture of a diagram at the time. This is near downtown New York. If any of you have been to New York, near the World Trade Center area, this is what it looked like back in the late 1800s. It was where the Syrian and the Lebanese Muslims all congregated. New York has different neighborhoods like Little China, Little Italy, what have you. So the Muslim Syrians had conquered the area near Ground Zero. And this is an interesting area, and the title was When an Arab Enclave Thrived Downtown. The point being that geography is very fluid. And so, what you perceive to, be in existence today isn't necessarily what always was in existence. So, this is an important point to make. Next point. Next slide, please. This slide here. Next slide, please. We'll skip over this part. Next. So here I wanted to talk about the number of masajid that have been founded in America. So as I mentioned, many of the early masajid were founded in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But really the growth of the masajid or the mosques in America is a relatively recent phenomenon. So you can see that, although the first purpose-built masjid is most likely, somewhere here in Michigan, in 1921, there was a masjid built in Highland Park, by a group of brothers, but eventually that masjid went out of business. Here, this slide shows you the number of masajid founded over time. And I think the interesting statistic for me is just looking at the number of masajid in 2000 and the number of masajid in 2010. So almost a 74% increase in the number of masjids that have been founded. So many of the masjids in America are relatively young, meaning they're still, organizationally not well established, and still organizationally they have a lot of room and areas to go. Now in the next slide, I wanted to go into more detail and talk about the first Shi'i center in USA. By the way, I don't like the term Shi'i because it's problematic. It really gets in the way of our understanding of the deeper concept. But I'll mention it here to make a point. The first masjid devoted exclusively to the followers of Ahlul Bayt was founded in 1924. Does anyone know where it was founded? Does anyone want to take a guess? Michigan, I hear? Yeah, Michigan City, that's right. Michigan City, Indiana, in 1924. And this is a picture of that masjid in Michigan City, Indiana. And eventually they brought Sheikh Shirri, Allah yarhamu, to essentially lead the congregation, which at the time was a mixture of Sunnis and followers of Ahlul Bayt and other groups. And eventually, as all of you know, Sheikh Shirri migrated here to Dearborn. Now, there's more information about this history if you go to the next slide. And this beautiful book called Shi'ism in America by Professor Liaqat Tahkim, who's now at McMaster University. I would urge all of you to buy this book and to read it, because he really gives a very nice overview of the history of the followers of Ahlul Bayt in North America. And he mentions the following, numbers. Just if you can look at the, institutions and the number of masajid that have been founded over time, you'll notice that most of the masajid were founded in the 1980s and then in the 1990s. Now, the interesting thing that Professor Liaqat mentions in his book is in the next slide. These are the challenges facing Shi'i institutions. And I want you to notice the challenges that, he conducted a survey. So he asked all of the masajid and all of the institutions of the followers of Ahlul Bayt, what are the challenges that your organizations are facing? And based on that survey, he came up with the following list. So the number one challenge is facility. Many of the followers of Ahlul Bayt don't have a full-time dedicated facility. So it's a struggle for them. So alhamdulillah, Allah has blessed this community with a full-time facility. So that number one challenge is not a barrier here. The number two challenge is transmitting religion to youth. So the point being that, there's this disconnect between the pioneering generation, the generation that established the masjid, and the subsequent generation of individuals that followed. And this is obviously a problem, not just with the followers of Ahlul Bayt, but it's actually a universal problem that's being encountered across all religions in America. The fastest growing religion or religious group in the United States is this group of people called the nuns. How many of you have heard of the nuns? N-O-N-E-S. So these are people that don't affiliate with any particular community. And this is the most rapidly growing group. After the nuns comes the Muslims and the Hindus. The point being that every religious group is facing this challenge of transmitting the religion in a relevant way to youth. And then, of course, there's the typical issues of finances and what have you. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of geographical distribution of American Muslims, most of the American Muslims live in, either California, New York, Illinois. Michigan is number 5 or 6. These statistics are a bit old. I think they're, maybe 9, 10 years old. So they'll need to be updated. But I think the categories still hold true. The next slide. In terms of the top occupations of American Muslims, this is based on a survey conducted by a professor named Ihsan Bagbi. He's come up with the following numbers. See, the number one occupation of Muslims in America is students, followed by engineers, physicians, homemakers, programmers, researchers, administrative assistants. You'll notice that nowhere on the list is terrorist listed. So, most Americans are actively contributing to different walks of life in their own way. And so the question becomes, why are we reviewing this history of Muslims in America? George Orwell has his book 1984, and he has a interesting statement in there. He says, "He who controls the past controls the present. He who controls the present controls the future." Meaning, if you're unable to control your own past, you won't be able to move forward. If you don't know your past, you won't be able to control your future. And the point being here, when we go back to the ayah, سَيَقُولُ السُّفَهَاءُ مِنَ النَّاسِ مَا وَلَّاهُمْ عَنْ قِبْلَتِهِمْ الَّتِي كَانُوا عَلَيْهَا قُلْ لِلَّهِ الْمَشْرِقُ وَالْمَغْرِبُ. When the silly people say what has caused them to change their prayer directions, say to them, to Allah belongs the east and the west. This is the main takeaway from tonight's presentation, that Islam is really rooted deeply in the essence of the United States, and it's actively contributing, not just in the past, but even moving to the future. Many people feel pessimistic with the recent election, but I think that these are actually very optimistic and hopeful times. If you go to the next slide, because what this type of pressure has caused is really a creative renaissance within the Muslim community. You see that that there are certain pockets of Muslims that are using these negative pressures and trying to come up with something better. فَادْفَعْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ إِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا. Verily with hardship comes ease. And it's interesting how certain Muslims, when in reaction to all of these difficulties, will just sort of become insulated, whereas other Muslims just go out there and become more proactive. And here's just a picture of some of the individuals who in their own way, shape, or form are trying to contribute to the American narrative of Muslims in America. And I've purposely included, people like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Linda Sarsour, Ibtihaj Muhammad, Dave Chappelle. Although not a truly practicing Muslim, he goes out there and he says he's a Muslim, and he comedically tries to depict the Muslim situation. Representative Keith Ellison, this sister in the red hijab. I don't know how many of you know her. Her name is G. Willow Wilson. She's come up with the first Muslim comic book with Marvel. Marvel, the comic book company that's come up with Spider-Man. She's come up with a female Muslim superhero. That's really interesting. And obviously beyond that, there are many institutions, both here in Michigan and beyond, that I think are making a tremendous contribution. I've listed here, for example, Sayyid Hassan's book here, American Crescent, which I think is really arguably one of the finest books that I've seen that really puts a human face to Islam in America. Then obviously there are many tremendous organizations here in the area that I would urge all of you to support, to continue this hopeful attitude and this positive, فَادْفَعْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ وَادْفَعْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. Respond with that which is more beautiful. Organizations like Tawheed Summer Camp, Zaman International, and then obviously there are contributing tremendously to the community, battered women and what have you. And then obviously there are Muslim civil defense organizations like the Muslim Justice League and Muslim Advocates. So the point being that rather than being pessimistic about the situation, I think there's ample ammunition and ample opportunity to create something more beautiful and to leave our own imprint on society, like the previous Muslims have left behind, like Umar ibn Sa'id, who left behind the written Quran, like Hajj Ali, who left behind his camels, like Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb, who left behind the masjid. The question becomes, what will you leave behind? What will we leave behind that will leave a lasting influence on the country and on the image of Muslims in America today? And the final words, I'd like to conclude with these words of Imam Ali. And I really love these words because they really define the concept of what a nation is and what a homeland is. Many times we oftentimes think of a homeland as being the place of our genetic origins or of our ethnic origins. Imam Ali alayhi salam takes a very different position. He doesn't define a homeland with respect to your ethnic roots or with respect to your origins, but he defines a homeland in the following way. He says, with wealth, a strange land is a homeland, while with destitution, even a homeland is a strange land. Meaning, if you're treated well in a society, if you're wealthy, not in terms of material wealth, but just the presence of comforts. For example, just the fact that you have running water here in America puts you in the top 5% of people in the world. Think about that. Just the fact that you have access 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to pure, running, clean water makes you among the wealthiest people, not just in the world today, but in world history. So when Imam Ali alayhi salam says, with wealth a strange land is a homeland, this is what he's talking about. Look at the tremendous resources and assets that we have here. The question becomes, how will we use these tremendous wealth and resources and assets to improve, to spread the message of Islam in a positive way, and to improve the condition of the society in which we're living in. Tonight, I just wanted to take this time to present this, and tomorrow we'll get into more detail with regard to Ramadan. But I thought, this would be a good opportunity, given that tomorrow is the first day of Ramadan, to essentially just, take this time to reclaim the narrative of Muslims in America and hopefully demonstrate that Islam has made tremendous contributions in line with when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Lillahi al-mashriq wal-maghrib, to Allah belongs the east and the west. This is what Allah is talking about. Islam isn't just something that's relegated to the east, but rather it's universal. Everywhere where people submit to the Almighty, that's where Islam exists. ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا وأخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. صلوات.
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Thank you, Dr. Sadiq. That was a very educational and illuminating lecture. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Brothers and sisters, before you leave, just a reminder that inshallah tomorrow and the day after, or at night, I will be having Dr. Sadiq with us. We're very honored to have him here. And before you leave, just grab an amsakiya. We have the dates of the adans, and as well as who will be here at our programs, and we have one with an image as well. And so, inshallah, we hope to see you tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.